In today's episode, we delve into the intricate world of tariffs and their extensive effects on the construction sector. We'll examine how unexpected price changes due to the fluctuating tariffs being imposed on various countries from the contracting phase to the successful delivery of a project. I'm Amy Kottman, and you're listening to Baker Hosts. Joining us today is partner Michael Cortez. Michael specializes in representing real estate owners, architects, contractors, and energy companies on a wide variety of complex commercial and industrial construction projects. He has significant experience representing clients in drafting and negotiating construction contracts under multiple project delivery systems and is a frequent author and speaker on construction law topics. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you, Amy. I'm very excited to be here on your show to talk about this very important topic that I seem to be hearing about daily, crossing my desk on emails and phone calls. It's a very important topic I'm seeing in my practice.
Knowing that, Michael, can you explain how President Trump's tariffs have specifically impacted the construction industry?
Sure. First, I'll take a little bit of a step back. And obviously, in general, uncertainty is really the issue. That uncertainty creates risk. And we're seeing it every day in the stock market and in the grocery stores and everything else. Financial markets don't like uncertainty, and the construction industry is no different. And obviously, part of that is the materials in the countries that we buy those materials from that we use in the construction industry. They come from China, which is obviously kind of the big issue or target right now. But it also comes from other countries like Canada and Mexico and others that some days are on the list, some days are not on the list. They have deals, do they not have deals? So again, that uncertainty is creating this ripple effect in the industry by using these countries that provide all these essential materials like steel and lumber and copper, aluminum, cement, those things that are essential in the construction industry. And the specific impact is that uncertainty in and of itself is creating a problem for contractors to be able to get solid or pricing that doesn't change on a daily basis for these materials. And because of that, that's causing a lot of projects to be paused and to be put on hold pending kind of stabilization, if any, of these potential tariffs. And then, of course, the current projects that were already under contract and either materials were bought or were not bought prior to January, those projects are being impacted specifically as well, because then you have these issues of, hey, who's going to pay for these tariffs that are either going up, that we think are going up today, or we're not sure until they get delivered. So the current projects as well as future projects are very severely impacted at this point.
Well, what are some of the most significant challenges you've seen clients face due to these tariffs?
Well, as I mentioned, it's all about price. And fortunately or unfortunately, we've been here before during COVID, and the issues surrounding supply chain and how do we get the materials. But this is a little bit of a different context, but it's still the same uncertainty. So we have a little bit of a playbook to go by. But specifically, the challenge is how do you price that uncertainty when you're trying to bid a job if you're a contractor? And I've read materials recently that are talking about at least a 20% increase in material pricing. And while that may not generally sound like a lot, it is when you're dealing with these very large projects. And that 20% is, at this point, just a guess. And so you have some people who are trying to figure it out that way. And then I've talked to other clients that have told me that some contractors are just not pricing it at all. So there's no risk or price fluctuations in their price, which therefore, again, leads to an unknown or uncertain price. And that's because their subs can't get solid pricing on this. So they're just not including it at all. So you have these different ways of dealing with it, these challenges of pricing uncertainty. And also the current projects that are having to deal with the delays and trying to figure out how are we going to figure this out as we go along in the project. So those are some of the challenges we're dealing with, and it's causing an issue with potentially also the schedule, which is another important aspect of construction. Not only the price of the project, but the time it takes to build it. Time and money, as we say in the construction industry. And this timing, how it's being impacted is this process of what was happening during COVID when people were running to the grocery store and buying up all the toilet paper. That's what we're seeing a little bit in the market today in the construction industry, where there's a lot of early buyout and people are buying materials much earlier in the process. And it causes a ripple effect by basically causing shortages or potential shortages of certain materials and therefore delays in getting them shipped to certain projects. And again, another thing we saw during COVID coming back in this tariff age that we're in is the change in the pricing structures of construction projects. There's very few that I've seen across my desk recently that are what we call fixed price or lump sum pricing structures. The contractor assumes all the costs, which therefore would include the taxes, which would include the tariffs, and it would include everything else. And as I mentioned earlier, the uncertainty in pricing is causing a real problem or risk for contractors to do that. So we're seeing a lot more of what we call cost plus or GMP pricing, which means the cost of the work plus a fee, which would be subject to a guaranteed maximum price or a GMP. So we're seeing a lot change in those sorts of structures and somewhat, at least depending on who you talk to, inflated costs and schedules that are specifically causing some of these projects to be paused because that's not in the budget and that's not what the loan says for the bank on the cost. So it caused a lot of issues in that respect.
Michael, you've talked about the challenges that we're facing. Could you talk a little bit now about the strategies that clients can use to navigate during this volatile market?
Sure. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the contract strategies and dealing with this because that's what I deal with on a daily basis. And so the first question that I always get when something like this comes up in the market, some unknown risk that we're trying to draft around is force majeure. Is this a force majeure? And answer is it depends, unfortunately. And so the reason for that is because most contracts deal with force majeure, and force majeure is a product of contract. It's very specific about what you put in your contract. And I warn clients always be very careful about what's included in a force majeure, but also what's excluded. And that can be important too. So for price escalation or for tariff issues, specifically what I'm counseling clients on in the contract world is to be very specific about making sure that there's what we call a change in law, because this is a very specific issue about tariffs and taxes and changes in law after the execution of the contract. Of course, that's an unknown. And so that's a very specific language that you need to make sure that's provided in your force majeure clause. And if you're a contractor, it also needs to address not only what's included in the force majeure, but also that it includes any associated cost relief, not time relief, because most force majeure clauses and most industry standard force majeure clauses only address schedule relief or time relief related to force majeure, not cost. So you need to be careful about that. And then obviously the main issue that I'm dealing with in the contract world with regard to the tariff issues are price escalation or tariff clauses. There are some industry standard forms that address escalation issues, like the consensus docs, which are produced by the AGC, which is the Association of General Contractors. But it's very broad and generic, and it still needs to be addressed in a specific manner. So the things that you need to be worried about in your contracts when you're dealing with these tariff or price escalation issues are what specific materials are we talking about? Is it all materials or just the certain ones? So just list them specifically. Don't just assume that all materials are going to be subject to tariffs because they're not. Are there going to be issues related to storing or warehousing these materials if you're going to buy them earlier in the contracting phase than you normally would? Who's going to be responsible for the storage costs, the insurance of the warehouse or wherever you're storing it? Who's going to be responsible for the transportation of these materials from off-site to on-site? Those sorts of things need to be addressed, as well as potential issues regarding threshold pricing risk. In other words, I've seen some price escalation clauses that only quote unquote kick in at certain thresholds, 5%, 10%. If it's 10% over what's assumed in the contract, then the contractor gets relief, or if it's 5%, or if it's 20%, whatever you negotiate that threshold. So I've seen some of those clauses be very specific about that. What material price index are you going to use for these materials? What type of notice is going to be required by the contractor to start the process of negotiating these price escalation increases? And that comes up a lot because, again, it's a realistic response to how do you deal with price escalation issues due to tariffs or any escalation issues. Is, just like anybody else, owners don't like surprises and usually don't like surprises that cost more money. So providing that notice and being very specific in your price escalation clauses can give the owner the opportunity to say, whoa, time out. Let's talk about this material and where we're getting it from, deal with the increases that are associated with it. And so, in other words, how do you deal with identifying the tariff increases? How do you document them? And how do you measure it? And what's the relief? Is it the full price increase or part of it? Or how do you deal with the different issues that come up with that and in your allowances or your contingencies for these price escalations?
Are there other considerations outside of contracts that clients can use to navigate this volatile market?
Oh, sure. Yes, absolutely. And the biggest one that I can convey to a contractor is to qualify your bids. Make sure your proposals and your bids have very clear language about what type of tariff rate is included, what materials might or might not be subject to tariffs, where are they coming from, what are the issues relating to that as far as the contractor's concerned. Another strategy is an early buyout. Specify a timeline when you're going to buy materials earlier than you normally would in your schedule. If you're an owner or a contractor, lean on your supplier relationships. Try to figure out if they can get some sort of bulk pricing and get a better deal if you buy more materials up front, and dealing with those sorts of relationships in the industry. And a big one that I'm seeing is what we call value engineering. And that involves all the parties getting together and looking at and deciding if there need to be a change in the plans or the specifications regarding certain materials that are being used, if in a safe way, obviously, that can reduce the impact of price escalation by getting certain materials from different countries that are non-tariffed. So the value engineering process is very important in trying to figure out how do we deal with that, like substitutions, for example. There's a washing machine from China that's going to be subject to this extremely high tariff. Is there another country? Can we get it from locally? Can we get it domestically, or can we get it from a different country that's non-tariffed to offset that escalation for that washing machine from China? Another strategy that I've seen talked about recently is the use of custom bonded houses or foreign trade zones. And those are certain locations that you can store materials without tariffs until they're removed. So that'll be important. But I have a feeling those will get booked up pretty quick, and in getting those to be available for when you need them might be difficult. So again, that early communication, communicate early and often. Try to figure out if there's better ways to build your project, to price your project, and just be as upfront as possible.
We've talked about the challenges and we've talked about ways to navigate in this current market. Could you take a look into your crystal ball and tell us, how do you foresee the new administration's policies influencing the construction sector moving forward?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one in this environment. But yeah, the tariff fluctuations, until they stabilize or deals start to get done and people are figure out a way to get those deals done, we're going to have this continuous conversation about how to deal with price uncertainty, and at least in the tariff context. Other markets that are getting impacted by the current administration's policies in different areas are the renewable energy market, the pause in IRA funding or the Inflation Reduction Act that was put in place by the Biden administration that was funding a lot of renewable wind and solar projects that were frankly on my desk the past 2 years were basically stopped in their tracks. And affordable housing projects, I'm seeing slowdowns in those. Not a complete stoppage, but just it's taking longer to get those deals done in this current administration, and the policies towards affordable housing, I think, are different, obviously, than the previous. So I think that's an important market to deal with right now that I'm seeing slowdown in. And there are a few bright spots in this current market. Student housing seems to be impervious to a lot of this because kids go to school and they need a place to sleep. And so student housing seems to be a continuous upswing as far as markets and projects. Data centers. Data centers are also another market that's continuing to stay hot. And then, of course, and another big headline that we're seeing almost on a daily basis is the current administration's policies on immigration enforcement. And as everyone knows, the construction industry has a high immigrant labor force, and this will severely impact the construction labor market. And I'm seeing articles almost on a daily basis that are starting to prepare for this. And so I foresee some labor shortage issues rear their heads again in this current administration. And essentially, I think the takeaways from all of this are just, regardless of the policies, and I think these are just good things to be doing in the construction industry, and something I've always tried to emphasize with my clients is communicate early and often, be upfront. Hiding the ball or hoping for the best is usually not a good plan in the construction industry. Things tend to go wrong at the worst time. So being upfront about the issues that we're dealing with in your contract and in your bid are extremely important. Draft realistic or specific clauses, and price escalation is no different than any other clause about that, is dealing with the different issues that I mentioned previously, from storage to price index to notice to supporting documentation to all those sorts of things. Be specific and be realistic. That's kind of what I tell my clients. Don't put something in a contract that you're not going to do, or that you're realistically not going to do, because then that's just going to be a problem. And lastly, be flexible, be creative, look at alternative sources, look at different ways to deal with the current market and how to navigate kind of these troubled waters that we're dealing with.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Michael.
You're very welcome.
If you have any questions for Michael, his contact information is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening to Baker Hosts. Comments heard on Baker Hosts are for informational purposes and should not be construed as legal advice regarding any specific facts or circumstances. Listeners should not act upon the information provided on Baker Hosts without first consulting with a lawyer directly. The opinions expressed on Baker Hosts are those of participants appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the firm. For more information about our practices and experience, please visit bakerlaw.com.